Imagine sinking slowly beneath the waves, the sunlit world above you growing quieter with every meter. The surface shimmers and recedes, blues deepen, greens fade, and somewhere around 200 meters down, the last generous rays of daylight thin into something barely there, a faint and ghostly glow that struggles to reach you before giving up entirely. You have crossed a threshold. Welcome to the Twilight Zone, and welcome to Slumber Sea. Tonight, we are drifting into one of the least visited and most quietly astonishing places on our planet, the ocean's mesopelagic layer, that vast, dim corridor between the sunlit shallows and the true abyss below. So find a comfortable position, let your breathing settle, and let the deep carry you gently into the dark. The Twilight Zone earns its name honestly. From roughly 200 meters down to about 1,000 meters, light levels drop so low that photosynthesis becomes impossible. By the time you reach the lower edge of this layer, barely 1% of the sunlight from the surface manages to filter through the water above. It is not pitch black. Not yet, but it is close. A diffuse and bluish dimness is all that remains, and even that dissolves into nothing as you descend further. For any plant or alga trying to capture energy from the sun, this is already the end of the road. But light is not the only thing that changes here. Temperature falls sharply through this layer, dropping from more than 20 degrees Celsius near the upper boundary down to around 4 degrees near the bottom, a steep and steady decline that happens across a relatively short vertical distance. The water also becomes more stratified as you go deeper, with different layers sitting on top of one another and very little mixing between them. That stratification limits how much oxygen can reach these depths from the surface, and in certain regions, the mesopelagic hosts genuine oxygen minimum zones, pockets of water where dissolved gas is scarce enough to restrict which animals can survive and for how long. These conditions together create a layer that is stable in its own way, predictable even, but deeply demanding for anything trying to make a life there. For most of human history, we did not know that anything much did. The Twilight Zone was simply too deep to sample easily and too dark to observe directly. Then, in 1942, during the Second World War, naval operators using sonar began detecting something strange. Their instruments were returning echoes from what appeared to be a second sea floor, a dense, reflective layer sitting somewhere in the midwater column. It seemed to rise and sink with the hours of the day. It was not rock. It was not sediment. It was alive. That discovery, made almost by accident, introduced the world to what scientists now call the deep scattering layer, a vast congregation of animals, so numerous and so tightly packed that they could bounce a sound wave back like solid ground. The name Twilight Zone came later, borrowed from the eerie quality of the light and the sense that this place sat between two more familiar worlds, neither truly lit nor completely dark. It stuck, partly because it captured something real. This is a borderland, a zone of in-between, a place that has always been there, enormous and teeming, yet somehow overlooked. And enormous really is the right word. The mesopelagic layer covers roughly 60% of Earth's surface area and makes up about 20% of the ocean's total volume. It is one of the largest habitats on the planet by almost any measure. Recent acoustic surveys suggest the fish alone living in this zone may represent somewhere between 6,000 and 15,000 million tons of biomass. an estimate that is an order of magnitude higher than what scientists believed just decades ago. Though researchers are careful to note that these figures carry real uncertainty tied to the difficulty of measuring creatures that scatter sound in complicated ways, the scale implied is staggering. We may have been dramatically underestimating the living weight of this layer for generations. And that matters enormously, not just as a fact about fish, but because the Twilight Zone appears to play a quiet and critical role in the planet's own chemistry, in how carbon moves from the sunlit surface down into the deep ocean, in how the ocean breathes and what it stores. Strange animals live here. Some glow in the dark, some migrate thousands of meters every single night. Some are barely known to science. In the hours ahead, we will meet them all. But for now, simply let yourself descend, slowly, curiously, into the dim and living blue. Down here, the rules of survival are rewritten by the light, or rather by almost none of it. Every creature that makes a permanent home in the Twilight Zone carries the evidence of that constraint somewhere in its body, in the shape of its eyes, the texture of its skin, the arrangement of tiny glowing organs along its flanks. The darkness is not simply a backdrop. It is the central fact of life, and the animals here have been answering it for so long that their answers have become extraordinary. Start with skin. In a place where light is scarce, you might expect color to matter less. But the opposite turns out to be true, because even faint light can reveal you to something hungry. Some fish in the Twilight Zone have evolved skin so dark it borders on the impossible. Certain species reflect less than half of 1% of any light that strikes them. That is not just dark the way a shadow is dark. It is an almost total absorption, achieved through an arrangement of pigment-containing cells, packed in a way that traps and scatters incoming photons instead of bouncing them back. The result is a surface that seems to swallow light, making the fish nearly invisible against a water column that is itself close to black. It is camouflage built not from pattern or color, but from the geometry of skin at a microscopic level. When you imagine one of these fish drifting past you, you would not see a silhouette. You would see almost nothing. And yet, vision still matters here, which is why eyes in the Twilight Zone can take forms that seem almost impractical at first glance. Many species have eyes far larger than their body size would suggest, maximizing every photon they can gather in conditions where photons are precious. Others have evolved tubular eyes, long cylindrical structures that point upward and give the animal a fixed field of view, aimed at the faint, downwelling light from above. One such animal, the tube eye, a slender and unusual fish, has 6 copies of the gene that codes for the light-sensitive protein in its rod cells. That kind of genetic expansion hints at a visual system tuned to extraordinary sensitivity, capable of distinguishing between subtle shifts in the dim light that filters down from the surface. Some species take this even further. The silver spiny fin, a deep-dwelling fish with large reflective eyes, carries around 38 copies of that same rod opsin gene and may express more than a dozen functional variants simultaneously. Each variant is sensitive to a slightly different wavelength, collectively spanning the range of faint daylight that reaches these depths, as well as the blue and blue-green wavelengths that bioluminescent animals typically produce. It is worth sitting with that idea for a moment. This fish did not simply evolve a good eye. It evolved a visual system with multiple tuning dials, each one sensitive to a different shade of the near darkness. Whether all those copies contribute equally at every depth or life stage is still being worked out, but the genes are there, an expanded toolkit written into the DNA of an animal most people have never heard of. Because in the Twilight Zone, light is also made, not just received. Bioluminescence here is not a curiosity, it is a language. Photophores, which are small, specialized organs arranged in patterns along the body, belly or head, can produce controlled flashes or steady glows, and different animals use them for different purposes. One of the most elegant uses is counter-illumination, where an animal produces light from its underside that matches the faint glow coming from the water above. Seen from below, the animal disappears, its silhouette erased by its own glow, which blends it into the dim ceiling of light. Seen from above, the darkness of its back matches the water beneath. The animal essentially becomes the water it is swimming through. Other animals use bioluminescence to hunt. The anglerfish is perhaps the most famous example, dangling a luminous lure from a modified fin spine above its mouth. Curious prey, drawn toward the small point of light in the surrounding darkness, moves closer and the fish responds. It is a trap made of light, and it works because in this environment, a point of glow is an event, something that draws attention almost automatically. The deep sea did not invent patience. It invented bait. Then there is communication, the use of light to find a mate in a world where distance feels absolute. Some species produce flashes in patterns that appear specific to their kind, a signature in a place where sound and color both lose their usefulness over distance. Finding a partner in the mesopelagic is not easy. Food is scarce, populations are spread thin, and the volume of water to search is immense. A species-specific light pattern becomes a way of narrowing the problem, of saying precisely who you are across an otherwise anonymous dark. All of this comes at a cost, because the Twilight Zone is not generous. The water settles at around 4 to 5 degrees Celsius through much of this layer, cold enough to slow the metabolism of most animals considerably. Food arrives from above as a slow and uneven drift of sinking particles and dead organisms, and there is rarely enough. Growth is slow. Energy budgets are tight. Every adaptation that makes an animal more visible for one purpose, like a bioluminescent display, carries a corresponding risk of making it visible to the wrong audience. Every large eye that gathers more light also demands more metabolic investment to build and maintain. Life here is a careful negotiation between what you need to survive and what you can actually afford to spend. These trade-offs are written into the bodies of the animals as clearly as any adaptation. Slowed metabolisms, reduced musculature, soft tissues that minimize energy spent on structure. Many Twilight Zone fish have weak, watery flesh and small swim bladders, not from any lack of sophistication, but because the arithmetic of survival in cold, dim, food-limited water demands economy above almost everything else. And yet, within those constraints, the solutions these animals have found are among the most inventive in the living world, quiet, patient, and precise, like the zone itself. And yet, for all the stillness that the Twilight Zone seems to suggest, it is not a static place. Once each day, as the last trace of light fades from the surface far above, something shifts. A movement begins. It rises from the deep in waves, unhurried and immense, and it is repeated every night across every ocean on Earth. This is Deal vertical migration, and it is one of the largest daily animal movements the planet produces. Not on land, not in the air, but here, in the dark water, where millions upon millions of animals quietly reverse direction twice in every 24 hours. Up at night, down by day. The rhythm is so consistent and so widespread that it can be detected from ships using acoustic instruments, which pick up the scattering layer, a broad band of organisms that rises toward the surface as darkness falls and sinks back into deeper water as morning approaches. It looks on a readout like a slow tide breathing. What drives it is a calculation made not by any individual animal, but by the accumulated pressure of predation and hunger over immense spans of time. The surface ocean is rich. Zooplankton bloom there in the upper layers, feeding on the phytoplankton that harvests sunlight. Fish that rise to feed in those waters can fill their stomachs in a few hours. But the surface is also dangerous because light makes hunters effective. Visual predators, larger fish, and seabirds that plunge from above all work better where they can see. And seeing requires light. So the mesopelagic animals face a trade-off that evolution has resolved in a particular way. Feed in the rich, dangerous surface at night when darkness grants some cover, and spend the daylight hours retreating to depth, where cold, dim water makes visual predation far less efficient. The journey is not short. Many mesopelagic fishes travel from depths of around 800 to 1,000 meters up into the epipelagic zone, the sunlit upper 200 meters, then return again by dawn. They do this without resting, guided by subtle cues in light intensity that they detect with those large, sensitive eyes shaped over millions of years for exactly this purpose. As darkness thickens at the surface, the signal propagates downward and the animals respond. One by one, then in streams, they begin to ascend. It is a slow procession, not a rush, and it has the quality of something deeply practiced, a nightly routine so old it predates almost any human institution. Imagine following one of them upward. The water around it changes slowly. Temperatures rise by degrees. The crushing cold of the mesopelagic eases just slightly. Light does not appear, but its absence shifts character from the absolute dark of the deer to a darkness that carries memory of the sky above. At the surface, the animal feeds. Zooplankton are abundant here, drifting in concentrations that feel almost reckless compared to what waits below. The fish feeds quickly and efficiently, making use of the hours of darkness. Then, as the first faint brightening begins to move through the water from above, signaling the approach of dawn, it turns. The descent begins. By the time the sun is fully up, it is gone, back into depths where predators that hunt by sight find little advantage. Darkness, then, is not just an absence. It is a kind of protection that the animals borrow, a shield assembled from the physics of light and water. The night surface is not safe in any absolute sense, but it is safer, and safer is enough when hunger is the alternative. The risk of ascending is real, and the reward must outweigh it. For countless species across hundreds of millions of individuals, it apparently does. But the migration does more than feed a fish. It moves carbon. This is where the quiet rhythm of vertical migration connects to something much larger, the way the ocean breathes carbon out of the surface world and carries it toward the deep. A fish that feeds near the surface accumulates carbon in its body, in its flesh, its oils, its tissues. When it descends to depth and respires, it exhales that carbon as carbon dioxide into water that is already cold and under pressure, conditions that help keep it at depth. When it excretes, it releases organic material into the mesopelagic layers, far below where passive sinking particles would deliver it. This is active transport, driven by muscle rather than gravity alone. The numbers, where they can be estimated, suggest this process is substantial. Migrating mesopelagic fishes may account for somewhere between 6 and 40% of total carbon export at depths of 400 to 600 meters, a range that reflects genuine uncertainty in biomass figures and in how many of these animals are actually making the full daily journey. Acoustic estimates of mesopelagic fish biomass span an enormous range, from roughly 1 billion to 20 billion tons of wet weight, because the physics of sound scattering from swim bladders varies between species in ways that are difficult to correct for. But even the lower estimates make these fish a meaningful part of how carbon moves through the ocean. Models suggest active export by migrating fish can approach 30 milligrams of carbon per square meter per day at certain depths, a contribution comparable in scale to the passive settling of organic particles from above. This is how the surface and the deep are threaded together. A bloom of phytoplankton under the sun, grazed by zooplankton, eaten by small fish that then swim down into the dark and breathe and excrete and eventually die below the surface layer. The twilight zone is not just a habitat sitting between the surface and the abyss. It is a mechanism. The migration gives it motion, and that motion gives the deep ocean a portion of what it receives from the light far above. Each night, the scattering layer rises. Each morning, it sinks. The rhythm continues regardless of season, regardless of weather, regardless of what happens at the surface. It is patient and vast, and nearly invisible to anyone not looking for it. The ocean migrates in the dark, and in doing so, quietly shapes the chemistry of the entire planet. The first hint that something enormous was living in this dim band of water did not come from a net or from a camera. It came from echoes. Early sonar operators, listening for submarines and mapping the seafloor, noticed a strange return on their instruments. There appeared to be a second bottom, a false floor that rose and fell. By day, it sat hundreds of meters below the surface. At night, it moved upward. For a while, some thought it might be a physical layer in the water, a change in temperature or density. But the layer shifted too much, and it moved in ways that matched living things rather than geology. Gradually, the understanding sharpened. This was not another seafloor. It was a scattering layer made of countless small bodies that reflected sound. Today, we call it the deep scattering layer, and we know that much of its strength comes from mesopelagic fishes. Their bodies, their gas-filled swim bladders, and the other midwater animals that migrate with them all throw back sound in tiny pulses. An echo sounder sends down a beam. The beam hits this hidden band of life, and a portion of the energy returns. On a screen, it appears as a broad, continuous stripe. To the ship above, it is a reminder that the twilight zone is not empty. It is packed. When scientists first tried to translate those echoes into biomass, they faced a simple question that turned out to be difficult. How many fish does this backscatter represent? The first global estimates, based largely on nets that sampled narrow paths through the water, suggested on the order of 1,000 million tons of mesopelagic fish. That is a huge number, more than all land mammals combined. But the nets also broke easily, allowed agile animals to escape, and could only sample for brief intervals. They gave us a glimpse, not a full census. As acoustic surveys improved and spread across different oceans, a different picture emerged. When researchers used ship-mounted sonars to map scattering layers on basin-wide scales and applied careful models of how sound bounces off fish, the estimates grew dramatically. Instead of 1,000 million tons, the numbers shifted upward into a range of roughly 6,000 to 15,000 million tons of mesopelagic fish biomass worldwide. The span of that range is as important as its size. It tells us how uncertain the answer still is. These are not counted fish. They are inferred from echoes. But even at the lower end, 6,000 million tons is several times larger than the old figure. At the upper end, 15,000 million tons implies a standing stock of fish that may outrank all other fishes on Earth combined. Hidden in the mesopelagic, these animals would represent one of the largest pools of vertebrate biomass on the planet. Scale has consequences. A mass of animals like that does not simply exist quietly. It breathes, it eats, and excretes. It becomes prey for larger species and a predator of smaller ones. When scientists take the higher biomass estimates seriously and plug them into models of ocean metabolism, a striking number appears. Mesopelagic fishes, taken together, may be respiring the equivalent of around 10% of the primary production that happens at the surface. Primary production is the photosynthesis performed by phytoplankton, the microscopic plants of the ocean. They capture sunlight and carbon dioxide and turn them into organic matter. If 10% of that flow is ultimately passing through mesopelagic fish respiration, then these animals are not just a side note. They are a major conduit. They help decide how much carbon remains near the surface, where it can quickly return to the atmosphere, and how much is transported downward into colder, deeper reservoirs. The vertical migration you followed in the previous section is one part of that story. But even mesopelagic fish that do not travel far still feed on particles and plankton that originate higher in the water column. Their metabolism, their growth, their eventual deaths all tie the Twilight Zone into wider food webs. Large predators, from tunas to marine mammals, dip into this layer to feed on them. Smaller predators, including squid and bigger zooplankton, depend on them as well. Food passes through their bodies in both directions. They are middlemen in the ocean's economy, but there may be so many of them that their role begins to look central rather than intermediate. All of this depends, however, on how we read the sound. An acoustic survey does not see a fish directly. It sees the echo. To transform that echo into biomass, scientists need a quantity called target strength. Target strength describes how strong a reflection a single animal of a particular size and shape will produce at a given frequency of sound. If you know the target strength, you can work backward from the measured backscatter to an estimate of how many fish of that type are present. The difficulty is that target strength is not a fixed universal number. It depends on the anatomy of the fish, especially the swim bladder. Some mesopelagic species carry gas-filled bladders that resonate strongly at the frequencies used by ship sonars. Others have oil-filled bladders or reduced gas volumes, which reflect sound differently. Size matters too, as does the angle of the fish relative to the sound beam. When the physical conditions happen to line up, So that a swim bladder resonates efficiently, an individual fish can appear much brighter acoustically than it would otherwise, amplifying the signal by factors that can approach 25. That resonance is helpful when you want to detect that a fish is there at all. But it complicates the act of counting. If you assume that each unit of backscatter represents a certain amount of biomass and your target strength values are off, you can misjudge the total mass by a factor of several. This is one reason the range between 6 and 15,000 million tons is so wide. Different studies make different assumptions about target strength and about how much of the backscatter is produced by fish versus other organisms such as large zooplankton or squid. Sensitivity analyses try to explore these uncertainties. They ask, for example, what happens to the biomass estimate if fish contribute only a small fraction of the measured scattering, perhaps 20% or less. Under those conditions, you can more easily recover values similar to the old 1,000 million ton figures. But many measurements and comparisons suggest that mesopelagic fishes contribute a far larger share of the backscatter in most open ocean settings. When that is taken into account, the high biomass scenario keeps resurfacing. There is also the matter of species diversity. The Twilight Zone is not filled with a single kind of fish repeated billions of times. Surveys in just one region of the western tropical Atlantic have recorded around 200 species of mesopelagic fishes, grouped into multiple functional types, many with unique combinations of traits. Each species may have its own swim bladder morphology, its own behavior, its own preferred depth range and body size. That diversity makes the Twilight Zone resilient in some ways, but it also complicates the acoustic picture. A mixed community returns a mixed signal. For now then, we live with broad intervals rather than precise numbers. 6 to 15,000 million tons, roughly 10% of surface primary production passing through mesopelagic respiration. Between 6 and 40% of carbon export at certain depths, mediated by migrating fish in some regions. Each of these figures carries wide error bars. They are informed estimates, not exact measures, and they will be refined as new instruments, new models, and occasionally new nets peel back more of the uncertainty. Yet the direction of the revision has been consistent. As methods improve, the Twilight Zone becomes more crowded, more active, more important. What once looked like a relatively sparse layer between rich surface waters and specialized deep-sea communities is now understood as a densely inhabited engine room, where enormous amounts of biomass circulate in the dark. This shift in perception matters beyond academic curiosity. When policymakers and industries consider tapping mesopelagic fishes as a new resource, perhaps as food or as feed for aquaculture, they sometimes picture a distant, underused stock. But those fish are already deeply woven into ocean food webs and carbon cycles. They help sustain predators above and ecosystems below. They help shuttle carbon away from the atmosphere and into longer-term storage. Changing their abundance would not just alter one layer, it would ripple. The acoustic scattering layers that once puzzled naval operators have become maps of that hidden importance. Each band of backscatter is a sign of life where we once expected emptiness. Each echo is a reminder that the Twilight Zone, though dim, is a place where the planet's largest animal masses may pass their days unseen. In the next part of this journey, the focus will shift from the echoes themselves to the eyes and instruments that first descended into these depths. From the early daring of human-occupied vehicles like Trieste to the quiet persistence of modern surveys, you will see how our understandings of this vast, shadowed realm has grown, one careful observation at a time. For most of human history, the Twilight Zone and the depths below it were places of pure imagination. Sailors could measure depth with weighted lines, pulling up mud and shells from the shallows, but beyond a few hundred meters, the ocean became an abstract idea. People pictured monsters, bottomless pits, or a uniform void. There was no way to know which, because no one could go there and come back with more than a story. The first real encounters with the deep came indirectly. Dredges scraped up strange animals from abyssal plains. Early deep-sea thermometers and bottles hinted at cold, stable waters far beneath the surface. Sonar, developed for war, began to sketch seafloor shapes and revealed scattering layers. Each new tool took one step further into the dark. Yet, these were all partial senses. They measured temperature or depth or echoes. They did not put human eyes in front of the deep. Then, in January of 1960, two men entered a steel sphere, hung beneath a gasoline-filled float, and rowed it down into the deepest water on Earth. The bathyscaphe Trieste was not graceful. It was a heavy, awkward machine, but it was built for pressure, and that was what mattered. On that winter day, it descended into the Challenger Deep of the Mariana Trench. The instruments on board measured a depth of about 10,900 meters, more than 10 kilometers of water above the sphere. Outside, the pressure was over 1,000 times what you feel at the surface. Inside, Jacques Picard and Don Walsh peered through a tiny window into the Hadal zone. They reported fine sediment on the bottom, a sea floor not of jagged cliffs, but of soft ooze. They saw what appeared to be a flatfish-like animal, though that observation has been debated since. The view was brief, the light was limited, but the message was clear. It was possible for humans to reach the deepest point and return. The Trieste dive became a symbol. It showed that the abyssal and Hadal realms were not mythical. They were accessible, at least in principle, to direct observation. But it also highlighted how little we had actually seen. One dive to one trench floor for a matter of minutes in an ocean that covers most of the planet. The deeper zones remained largely untouched, and the dim band above them, the mesopelagic, was even less understood. Part of the reason is that human curiosity often leaps to extremes. The deepest trench, the tallest seamount, the coldest vent. The Twilight Zone, by contrast, sits in the middle. It is not the bottom. It is not the bright surface. It is a corridor of half-light between. For a long time, the public imagination was pulled down past it, toward abyssal plains and trenches, even as scientists were quietly discovering that this middle layer was full of migrating life. The false bottom detected by wartime sonar hinted at those migrations. Later, deep-diving submersibles like Alvin and Chinkai extended human presence into thousands of meters of water, visiting hydrothermal vents and abyssal hills. They showed the world chimneys of black smoke and fields of giant clams. These scenes captivated people, and rightly so. But most of those dives passed through the Twilight Zone as a transition. Lights blazing, vehicles moving steadily downward, they had little time to linger in the dim layer itself. To truly study the mesopelagic, another kind of seeing was needed. Not a single human eye pressed to a porthole, but instruments that could watch continuously and across great distances. The deep, scattering layers that puzzled early sonar operators became the focus. Modern research vessels now carry echo sounders that send out carefully calibrated pulses at specific frequencies. A common tool is a 38 kHz system with a narrow beam slanting down through hundreds of meters of water beneath the hull. Each ping travels, scatters off organisms and particles, and returns as a faint echo. Computers convert those echoes into a measure called acoustic backscatter, which, with careful modeling, can be related to the abundance of organisms in the beam. The Malaspina 2010 expedition took this approach and stretched it across entire ocean basins. From December 2010 to mid-2011, its ships circled through the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Oceans, running echo sounders day and night. Instead of isolated profiles, they collected a continuous curtain of soundings through the mesopelagic. When those data were mapped, the deep scattering layers became more than a curiosity. Patterns emerged. In bright, clear waters where sunlight penetrates deeply, the main scattering layer sat deeper by day. In more turbid regions, it rode higher. At night, large fractions of the backscatter, sometimes the majority, sometimes a smaller share, rose toward the surface as animals migrated to feed. In some areas, as much as 90% of the signals shifted upward and then sank back again with the dawn. This was not a void. It was a moving, structured community responding to light, geography, and ocean conditions. Malaspina and other global surveys showed that wherever you sailed over open ocean, some form of mesopelagic scattering layer was there, adjusting its depth, but rarely disappearing. The Twilight Zone took on a new identity, not a gap between surface and deep sea, but a persistent, planet-spanning habitat. At the same time, technology was shrinking in size and growing in autonomy. Human-occupied vehicles were joined and in many tasks replaced by robotic platforms. Autonomous floats, first designed to measure temperature and salinity, began to carry small echo-sounders of their own. They could drift up and down through the water column, profiling the distribution of midwater organisms season after season, even in places ships seldom visit. Specialized robots appeared that were built for the twilight itself. Some, like hybrid vehicles designed for quiet midwater work, can stay at depths of up to 1,000 meters for more than a day. They carry low-light cameras, red illumination that is less visible to many deep-sea animals, and samplers that can collect traces of environmental DNA. Instead of charging through the water like a descending elevator, they can match speed with individual organisms, following a single gelatinous predator or bioluminescent fish as it lives out its routine. Combined, these tools change the kind of questions we can ask. Instead of, "Is there life here?" we can ask, "How dense is it? How does it change with the moon? With seasons? With climate shifts?" We can measure not only presence, but behavior, the timing of vertical migrations, the spread of scattering layers during storms, the way communities reorganize around oxygen poor zones. There are still limits. Acoustic methods see best the animals that scatter sound strongly, especially those with gas-filled swim bladders. Gelatinous creatures, which may be abundant, can remain faint. Converting backscatter to biomass still depends on assumptions about anatomy and orientation, which is why estimates of mesopelagic fish mass span from 6 to 15,000 million tons. Even the most advanced robot cannot follow every animal at once. But the direction of change is unmistakable. What once appeared to be a dark, unmeasurable band is becoming a quantified part of the ocean system. We can now trace how much carbon migrating fish carry down with them each night and how much they respire at depth. We can map where functional groups of mesopelagic fish concentrate and how diverse their traits are from region to region. In a sense, the story runs from a single steel sphere at the bottom of one trench to a quiet network of ears and eyes spread around the globe. Trieste's brief visit to the Hadal floor proved that the deep sea existed as a physical place humans could reach. Modern eco-sounders, global surveys, and robotic vehicles show that the twilight zone above those depths is not a featureless descent route, but a dynamic, living layer. As you drift with this documentary, you are riding on that accumulated effort, decades of engineering, risk, and patient listening. The twilight zone is still shadowed, still mysterious in many ways, but it is no longer invisible. It has begun to speak in data as well as in echoes, and those signals now shape how we think about the ocean's past, its present workings, and its possible futures. In the final part of this journey, attention will turn to those futures, to how a changing climate, expanding low-oxygen waters, and human plans for extraction might alter this dim, crowded world, and to what might be lost if we disturb a system we are only just beginning to understand. The future of the twilight zone is being written now, even though most people will never see it. From the surface, this layer feels remote. It lies beneath shipping lanes and fishing grounds, separated by hundreds of meters of water. It is easy to imagine it as a refuge, buffered from whatever humans do above. But distance is not protection. The changes sweeping through the upper ocean do not stop at the depth where light fades. They sink, they spread, and they reshape the dim corridor where mesopelagic life has learned to endure. One of the most pervasive pressures is warming. As greenhouse gases trap more heat, the surface ocean warms first, but that heat is gradually mixed down. The twilight zone is cold by human standards, yet its temperatures are not fixed. A shift of even a degree or two can matter when you live close to physiological limits. Metabolic rates rise, oxygen demand increases. The narrow balance between how much oxygen the water can hold and how much the animals need begins to tilt. At the same time, oxygen itself is changing. In many regions, oxygen minimum zones are expanding and shoaling, creeping upward into depths that once held more breathable water. The twilight zone is often squeezed between warm, more oxygenated layers above and these low oxygen layers below. As the minimum zones swell, the habitable band can narrow. Some species may be forced into a thinner vertical slice. Others may find their traditional depths crossing into conditions where they can no longer maintain routine activity. Acoustic surveys already show that scattering layers bend around these oxygen-poor regions. Fish and zooplankton redistribute, forming bands along the upper edges of low-oxygen water rather than diving through it. If deoxygenation continues, these patterns could intensify, compressing communities and altering who overlaps with whom. Predators may be pushed closer together with prey or separated from them altogether. Migration routes might shorten or shift laterally, changing when and where carbon is carried down. Threaded through this reshaping water column is another kind of intrusion: plastic. Fragments, fibers, and microbirds descend not only to the seafloor, but through the twilight zone itself. Mesopelagic fishes have been found with plastic particles in their stomachs, mistaken for prey in the dark. Many of these animals are visual feeders, key links in the food web that convert tiny plankton into forms that larger predators can eat. When a plastic piece takes the place of a copepod in a bite, the consequences are not just for the individual fish. They propagate through trophic connections, through energy budgets, through the timing and quality of the carbon these fish package and send downward in their migrations. Other pressures are still mostly proposals on paper or in pilot projects, but they are aimed squarely at the depths where twilight life thrives. One is deep-sea mining. While the ore bodies themselves often lie on abyssal plains or seamount flanks, the waste they generate does not stay neatly on the bottom. Some plans envision releasing mining discharge into midwaters around 1,200 meters deep, overlapping the lower mesopelagic and upper bathypelagic. Models and experiments suggest that such plumes can replace more than half of the natural particles in the water, changing what zooplankton encounter as they feed. If over 60% of grazers find their environment suddenly clouded with artificial material, the entire midwater food web can be affected, even far from the seafloor machines. Another emerging idea is to fish the twilight zone itself. The enormous biomass estimates of mesopelagic fishes, thousands of billions of tons, perhaps 10 times more than traditional figures, are tempting to industry. Schools of small, oily fishes, many of them lanternfish, move predictably up and down each day. On paper, they look like a vast, underused resource that could be converted into fish meal, fish oil, or other products. Some proponents have argued that harvesting even a small fraction could relieve pressure on coastal stocks. But those global biomass numbers are built from acoustic backscatter and assumptions about anatomy and orientation. They carry order of magnitude uncertainties. Swim bladder shapes, sizes, and resonance all affect how strongly a fish echoes at a given frequency. A scattering layer that looks dense on a sonar screen may contain more or fewer animals than models suggest. When the margin of error is that large, it is hard to define what sustainable extraction would mean. Even if the numbers were clear, the structure of the communities themselves poses a deeper concern. Studies in the western tropical Atlantic, along the Fernando de Noronha Ridge, have shown that mesopelagic fish assemblages there have very high functional diversity but low redundancy. 200 species were recorded, spread across 10 major functional groups. More than 100 of those species possessed unique combinations of traits, distinct sizes, shapes, diets, vertical ranges, and bioluminescence strategies that no other species shared. When scientists calculated how many species could substitute for each other in ecological roles, the functional redundancy index barely rose above 1. Over-redundancy values were low, meaning there were few backups. Lose one species and you often lose a particular way of feeding, of migrating, of using light. In such a system, function is not copied many times over. It is distributed thinly, with individual species acting as sole carriers of certain behaviors. That has implications far beyond taxonomy. The biological carbon pump in the twilight zone relies on the summed actions of many different migrants. Some feed closer to the surface, others deeper. Some release waste as they rest at depth, others respire more on the way. Together, their habits decide how much surface carbon is shuttled into the ocean interior each night and how long it stays there. If fishing, warming, deoxygenation, or pollution selectively removes certain functional types, say the larger fishes with gas-filled bladders that move the most carbon per individual, The pump's efficiency could shift in ways that are not simply proportional to biomass lost. The catch is that these detailed functional studies come from specific regions. The western tropical Atlantic is only one slice of the planet's twilight zone. Other basins may have different species lists, different levels of redundancy, or different trait combinations. The cold subpolar gyres, the oxygen-starved eastern boundary currents, the enclosed basins of marginal seas. All of these likely host their own versions of mesopelagic communities. Some might be a bit more buffered against species loss, others perhaps even more fragile. But the pattern that emerges from the places we have looked is sobering. High diversity of roles, low duplication, and a strong coupling between individual species and ecosystem processes. When you overlay that with multiple human pressures, water warming from above, oxygen squeezed from below, plastics drifting through, mining plumes proposed at depth, and the possibility of new fisheries in between, the twilight zone begins to look less like a distant reserve and more like a delicate joint in the global ocean system. And all of this is being discussed while vast parts of the mesopelagic still have no names on their inhabitants. New surveys often find species that have not been described, and entirely new functional types may still be waiting in unvisited basins or poorly sampled layers. We have rough maps of scattering layers, broad estimates of biomass, and a few detailed case studies. But the finer threads, the full web of interactions, the sensitivity of carbon transport to subtle changes in behavior are largely unknown. This mismatch between what we know and what we are planning to do is at the heart of the twilight zone's fragile future. Decisions about mining permissions, pollution rules, and potential fisheries are moving ahead on timelines of years or decades. The ecosystem itself has built its patterns over millions of years, and our understanding of those patterns is still at the early exploratory stage. The risk is not only that we might extract too much, too quickly. It is that we might alter processes we do not yet recognize as important, simply because they do not register in our current data. Seeing the twilight zone this way does not require despair. It invites a different kind of attention. The same technologies that revealed deep scattering layers and deal migrations can help us monitor change, test the effects of warming and deoxygenation, and trace plastics and plumes as they spread. Functional trait studies can be extended to other basins, building a more complete picture of where redundancy is low and caution should be highest. Policies can be shaped with these uncertainties in mind, leaning toward restraint rather than assuming that unexploited automatically means inexhaustible. In the end, the twilight zone is both robust and delicate. It has persisted through past climate swings, ice ages, and shifts in ocean circulation. Its inhabitants are adapted to scarcity, darkness, and pressure, but they are not adapted to rapid layered human impacts that arrive all at once from many directions. The resilience we might hope for depends not just on biology, but on the choices made at the surface. As you rest with these thoughts, you can picture that dim band not as a distant abstraction, but as part of the same ocean that touches every shore. The migrators that rise at night connect its depths to plankton blooms. The carbon they carry helps regulate the climate that shapes our weather. What happens in the half-light matters, even if it is out of sight. If you would like to linger in this world a little longer, you can help keep journeys like this afloat. Feel free to like this video, Subscribe for more quiet explorations and share a comment telling us where in the world you are listening from. Your presence at the surface is part of this story too, another small signal reaching into the dark.